So same setup as this, but just with different numbers, right? With the 750, 375, 400, 400 here, and then varying x and y. And when there was no x and y, some people, about half, were willing to make that small sacrifice to really help the other person a lot. I have to say, I actually find it a little bit shocking that so many people didn't. But who knows how people interpret this game? I was having a conversation with someone after our last lecture last Tuesday. Maybe you go into the lab and you think of the lab experiment as just a competitive game where it's not nice or nasty. There's only a few bucks on the line here. I'm just going to try to win. I'm just going to try to be the, right? So maybe people are thinking in those terms instead of actually engaging the social preferences part of their brain. I don't know. But certainly a decent number of people is willing to make that sacrifice. If the person has been confronted with this the choice of whether or not to make a slightly costly sacrifice as a result of player 1 having given up a manifestly better for player 2 fair alternative, right? Player 1 actually kind of socked it to player 2 by 150 points. It's like, so I'm going to screw you to the tune of 150 points, and then I'm going to turn around and expect you to help me out by giving up 25 points for me to get 350? It's not what I learned on the playground. And sure enough, very few people still do. Right? We're way down here. But on the other hand, if the player gave up, like if player 1 is giving up, hey, I could have had 750 for sure, and screwed you and given you nothing, but I'm trusting you and putting things in your hands. I'm giving you the chance, because I don't want you to get nothing, so I want you to have something, but I'm giving you the chance to be a little bit nicer to me and give me back that 350 that I'm potentially sacrificing at a cost of only 25 to you. And remarkably, folks don't want to do it. I don't know if people are paying enough attention in this game to sort of see, hey, this person could have walked away with that self-same 750 they're asking you for and left you with nothing. Okay, they put their fate in your hands. And for 25 points, you're going to shaft them by 350? Not sure I'll trust you again. Right? So willingness to sacrifice for player 1 is withdrawn. They characterize this as withdrawal of sacrificial helpfulness, of positive reciprocity. But there doesn't seem to be much, not withdrawal of positive reciprocity, withdrawal of kindness. But there doesn't seem to be much actual positive reciprocity. You were nice to me, I'll be nice in exchange. At least not in this setup. It's a little unclear what the right answer is on that. Okay. So can everybody sort of see, can you see how you can get from these specific numbers to interpretations of what people's intentions are and what the price of being nice is and so forth? There's a little of that. Well, no, there isn't actually any of this on any problem set, but I'll try to see if I can come up with some practice problems that do this. Okay. Naturally, we want to go to some kind of mathematical model. There's not actually going to be any math in this, but some logic at least. Okay, so what can we conclude? What seem to be the generalizations? So clearly, rejections are not purely based on distributional preferences, right? I mean, if you're choosing between 8, 2, and 0, 0, and your choice depends upon what this person did, it clearly can't be just driven by how you feel about final outcomes. It doesn't seem likely that this is about face-saving concerns, right? It's unlikely that being mean to somebody, it's like, I don't want to be seen as too nice. If you've been mean to me, it could be that. It could be that there's shame involved. If you don't stick up for yourself, right? If there's a schoolyard bully and you don't stick up for yourself, you might be ashamed. It might be that. It doesn't seem that likely that you'd be trying to improve somebody else's opinion of you when they've just been mean to you. Okay? It seems more likely that preferences depend upon what the other player actually did and your desire to retaliate or be helpful. So a simplistic approach would be to rewrite player 2's utility in terms of other players' outcomes, both players' outcomes, and then simply say simplistically, well, let's just make it a function of what they gave up, what they walked away from in order to offer me the choice. Okay? But we actually are going to need to know quite a lot more than just what player 1's actions were, right? So just plugging in what the alternative was is a way of saying my preferences, player 2's preferences, aren't just driven by outcomes, but also by player 1's actions. But that's clearly not going to be complex enough. What we also need to include is what player 2 inferred from player 1's actions about player 1's intentions towards player 2, right? And that's typically going to be unobservable. So this we're going to have to think harder about what assumptions to make about that kind of what player 2 infers about player 1's intentions when she observes player 1's actions. So let me give you an example. Here's a 3-player game, okay? There's a set of possibilities for final allocations across the 3 players. And basically what's going to happen is there's 2 possibilities. One is that player 2 chooses the final allocation from this choice set, and the other possibility is that player 2 chooses the final allocation from this choice set. And player 1 gets to decide which player's hands they want to put their fate in, right? So player 1 is here. If player 1 puts their fate in player 2's hands, they're going to get either 10 or 12, some pretty nice outcomes. If they put their fate in player 3's hands, they're going to get 11 or 8, so lower outcomes, okay? The question is, under what conditions might player 1, the first question is going to be under what conditions might player 1 choose to put their fate in player 3's hands anyway? And then if we see player 1 playing right, putting their fate in player 3's hands, what conclusions might we think that player 3, what inference might player 3 make about player 1's intentions in doing so? Were they just trying to, were they trying to be nice to me, or were they trying to be mean to me? So, for example, where am I? Okay, suppose a credible outside party. I'm sorry, I don't have a real-world analog for this. I don't know who the credible outside party is. But suppose a credible outside party announces to player 1 and player 3 that player 2 is always selfish, right? So player 1, if we all believe that this outside party is completely credible and that this is an unambiguous truth, that means that player 2, and here player 2's outcomes, 10 and 12, that means player 1 believes that player 2 will choose 12, 12, 0, which is good for player 1, it's the best possible outcome for player 1, but it's terrible for player 3. So if player 3 then observes player 1 giving player 3 the choice, what will player 3 infer? Presumably, she will think that player 1 was trying to avoid a situation where player 3 gets hurt, and so she'll be nice by giving player 1 the higher outcome. At no cost to herself, admittedly. Might be more interesting if player 3 had to make a little bit of a sacrifice to repay that kindness, but given what we've just seen about evidence of positive reciprocity, we're just going to make this as easy as possible for player 3 to be nice. Now suppose instead that this credible outside party announced that player 2 always chooses an equal split. Very egalitarian, okay? Then we would have to assume that player 1 believes that player 2 is going to choose this outcome, which is good for everybody. Well, it's reasonably good for everybody. It's not quite as nice for player 1. And what that would seem to suggest, right, is that player 3 if player 1 knows that they could get 10 by giving the choice to player 2, but nonetheless chooses to go and give the choice to player 3 would have to conclude that that must be because player 1 was just trying to get more for themselves, right? And be selfish about it. Because it's going to hurt player 3 by 2 points. Okay? And so they might withdraw their willingness to be kind and choose 888 instead. Okay. So the point of all this is that player 3's reciprocity, their intention-based preferences, depends upon not what player 1 does, but what player 3 believes player 1's intentions are when they make their choice. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated. It's not just what she believes player 1. It's not just what she believes player 2 will do in response to player 1's actions. It's what she thinks player 1 believed about player 2's actions. So, for example, suppose that this credible outside party, suppose the outside party is believed by player 1 to be credible and announces that player 2 is selfish and therefore would choose the 12-12-0. But player 3 knows better, knows that this outside party is actually misunderstanding player 2 and that player 2 is actually going to choose 10-10-10. Right? And then player 1 goes to the right. Obviously, what matters to player 3 isn't what player 2 will actually do. They might feel like, oh, that so-called credible outside party, why did player 1 have to be so gullible? Why does everybody believe the Consumer Reports when I know that they're wrong? But nonetheless, I've got to just say what matters in terms of my feelings towards player 1 is what I know player 1 believed about player 2. Okay? So, complicated. So now let's I hope it doesn't seem like the whole class is rigged to always come around to what Matt Rabin thinks. It really is the case that he's just one of the most, as a friend of mine once said, he's an amazingly subtle thinker. He's also a very hard worker. You have to be both of those things to win the John Bates Clark Medal. You guys all know about raise your hand if you've never heard of the John Bates Clark Medal. Okay. The John Bates Clark Medal is, it's sort of second only to the, if it wasn't for the Nobel Prize in Economics, it would be the highest prize in the field of economics. Every academic field has its own highest prize, whatever that might be. In the field of economics, our highest prize is the John Bates Clark Medal. And then on top of that, the Bank of Sweden decided that they wanted to, that originally there was no Nobel Prize in economics. The Nobel Prizes are all given out by some foundation that was formed by this guy named Nobel. And then the National Bank of Sweden came along, I think sometime in the 60s, and said, you know what, we want to pile on this game, we're going to throw in a Nobel Prize for economics, and they funded it. Okay? That's why there's not a Nobel Prize in political science or anything else that you might consider. And that's coming from outside the field of economics. So the highest prize within the field of economics is the John Bates Clark Medal. And it goes every 2 years to the economist not yet 40, who has made the largest contribution to date in their career. And then they usually go on to win a Nobel Prize later in life. So Matt Rabin is the winner of the John Bates Clark Medal, and that's why he shows up in my lecture notes so often, not because I happen to be a Matt Rabin sycophant. Though that is also true. Okay. So here's a model of fairness equilibrium. And there, in the paper on this, there is a ton of math, which I'm going to spare you. Because what matters is not the math, but the concepts. Okay, so we can think about two players playing some simultaneous moves game, like the Battle of the Sexes. And we will think of each of them having a utility function. And these utility functions are defined formally in the paper, but I'm going to ignore that. But their utility function will be based on, driven by their own material payoffs, as well as the material payoffs of other people. And then also some psychological component that is driven by their impressions of fairness and unfairness, and then also how they respond to fairness or unfairness. So basically exactly what we were talking about a minute ago. It feels good to be mean to someone who's mean to you. Maybe it feels nice to be nice to someone who's nice to you. And maybe it gets more complicated than that. Now, what we're going to need to do, material payoffs will be relatively straightforward to understand. Psychological payoffs will depend upon both what your actions are, mean or not mean, and what your opponent's how you interpret your opponent's actions, mean or not mean. So the first thing we have to do is define what it means for these players to think of each other as mean or nice. So what does it mean? Sorry, I'm already tripping over the fact that the word mean is being used in two completely different ways in this paragraph. What does it mean for player 1 to be nice to player 2? Okay. Given what player 1 thinks player 2 will do, her possible strategies define a set of possible material payoffs for the two players. So, this will all seem abstract, and then we'll do an example on the Battle of the Sexes. Player 1 is deciding what to do. Player 1, we're going to suppose that player 1 has already formulated some belief about what player 2 is going to do in this game. Right? Go to the opera, go to football. Based on what player 1 believes player 2 is going to do, player 1's decision is going to determine the outcomes for the two players, and is going to either be nice to player 2 or not nice. Now, you might say, why do we start with the assumption that player 1 has a fixed belief about what player 2 is going to do? And the answer is, because otherwise we won't make any headway with our equilibrium concept. So when we get to the equilibrium definition, you'll see why we're doing that. But basically, we're going to start by assuming that player 1 has some beliefs about what player 2 is going to do. And based on their beliefs, player 1's actions are either going to be nice or not nice, right? So one possibility is that player 1 will make a choice such that, based on what player 1 thinks player 2 is going to do, player 1 is effectively making some sacrifice in order to give a benefit to player 2. Okay? And we're going to call that nice. If instead player 1's choice results in player 1 getting a higher material payoff, either with no effect on player 2, so just a gratuitous grab, or at some cost to player 2, I took the bigger slice and gave you the smaller one, then we're going to interpret that as mean. Okay? And if instead, the third possibility is that player 1, based on her beliefs about what player 2 is going to do in the game, player 1 makes a choice that just makes both of them best off. Right? So a sort of social utility, Hicks-Calder social welfare maximizing choice. No, sorry, not a Hicks-Calder, a Pareto maximizing. I'm going to make both of us better off. Then we're going to think of that as neutral. Even if it might have made player 2 better off, it doesn't represent any kind of sacrifice on player 1's part to make player 2 better off. So we don't really know whether they're being nice or not. We're going to interpret that as neutral. Okay? So whether player 1 is being nice or not depends crucially not only on what player 1 does, but on what player 1 believed player 2 would do when they made that choice. Right? Because we have to know what player 1 thought player 2 was going to do in order to determine what player 1's intentions are, nice or mean. Okay, so then whether player 2 thinks that player 1 is being nice depends upon what player 2 thinks player 1 will do, and on what player 2 thinks player 1 thinks player 2 will do. Okay? Now, ordinarily when somebody writes something like that down on a slide, their intention is to make you think that the process is ridiculous. But I want you to actually take this seriously. This is not intended to be ridiculous. It sounds a little ridiculous, but we need all of this structure. Okay? So whether or not player 1 is actually being mean or nice depends upon what player 1 believes player 2 will do, and then what player 1 chose to do based on those beliefs. Whether or not player 2 will interpret player 1's actions as mean or nice depends upon what player 2 believes about what was going on for player 1, which includes what player 1 did and what player 1 believed about player 2. Okay, so if that doesn't make sense right away, do cogitate on it, because this is the critical ingredient in this model. And then psychological payoffs are driven by reciprocity, like we were talking about a minute ago. A player will get a positive, will get a gain in utility if they're nice in response to nice behavior, a gain in utility if they're mean in response to mean behavior, and no psychological payoff in response to being neutral. They'll just go off and do their whatever maximizes their own welfare. Okay. And then a fairness equilibrium. This is really critical, and this is where this statement comes in crucially. A fairness equilibrium is any profile of strategies and beliefs, right? So an outcome in a game, a cell in a matrix, in which each player's strategy maximizes their own utility, both the material payoff and psychological part combined, given the other player's strategy, right? So it's a mutual best response. That's just the definition of Nash equilibrium. And, crucially, that each player's beliefs about the other player's beliefs are correct. About the other player's intentions. So that it has to be the case that in the equilibrium, I believe that you would do what you actually did, and that I believe you believed that I would do what I actually did. Okay? And that's the crucial element in this definition of equilibrium. So, let's actually see this in play in the battle of the sexes. Now, I've gotten sick of trying to keep track of who's the man and who's the woman in the battle of sexes, so I've made this Pat and Chris, right? Two names that can be assigned to either gender. And I'm indifferent as to whether Chris is the man or Pat is the man, or it doesn't matter to me anymore. I'm really okay with any of it. Okay. Now, what we know about this game is that the two Nash equilibria are opera, opera, football, football, right? Because on the basis of material payoffs only, deviating in any direction, deviating either player 1 goes down to football or player 2 goes across to football, makes both of them worse off. And so it's very hard to imagine any kind of distributional preferences that would make that, like, no, my distributional preferences are I just hate us both. It's a little hard to believe. Now, let's just first check and make sure that these two Nash equilibria, and we'll focus on first just one of them since they're symmetrical. Let's first check and make sure that the Nash equilibria are also fairness equilibria, right? So let's suppose that player 1 believes player 2 will go to the opera. Okay? Player 1 believes player 2 will go to the opera. Given what player 1 thinks player 2, and she also believes that player 2 believes that she will go to the opera. Okay, so player 1's belief is, so Chris believes that Pat will go to the opera, and Chris believes that Pat believes Chris will go to the opera too. Okay? Which means, well, I'll get back to what it means. Under those conditions, if that's what player thinks, and if that's what player 2 thinks, then player 1, observing that player 2 goes to the opera, just thinks, oh, that's neither nice nor mean. Right? Pat knew that I was going to go to the opera, so going to the opera as well just made Pat and me both better off. That's neutral. Right? Player 1 thinks player 2 is being neutral. And then symmetrically, of course, Pat will think that Chris is just being neutral. Well, Pat knew that I was going to go to the opera. Chris knew that I was going to go to the opera, so Chris going to the opera too, that just makes Chris better off and doesn't hurt me, so that's neutral. Given that, right, then we assume if they both think the other one is behaving neutrally, that they'll just both try to maximize their own payoffs, and sure enough, and you could have them maximizing some non-purely, some social preferences, some distributional preferences other than pure self-interest, would almost certainly still get them both going to the opera. Okay? So that's a fairness equilibrium, because what you do is you start by saying, if this, it's almost like you can't predict what's going to be an equilibrium, but you can test whether or not a certain outcome is an equilibrium. We test whether this is an equilibrium by saying, first, in order for beliefs to be correct, what must people have believed? So if they wound up going opera, opera, then it must be the case that player 1 thought player 2 was going to go to the opera, and that player 1 thought player 2 thought player 1 was going to go to the opera, because otherwise, any other beliefs would have been incorrect. So based on based on the outcome we're investigating, in this case opera, opera, we can start by defining what correct beliefs must have been, what the beliefs must have been in order for them to be correct. Then we can see, based on those beliefs, whether each player's behavior was nice, mean, or neutral, and then we can think about psychological payoffs. So let's take that to the next step and actually see those psychological payoffs in action. Let's explore whether, I think I'm doing this one. Player 1 believes player 2 will go to the opera. Yeah. So let's investigate now whether football opera can also be a fairness equilibrium. We know that football opera is not a Nash equilibrium under pure self-interest, right? Because either one of them could be better off by deviating. And we also know, or at least it seems reasonable to assume, that under any remotely reasonable definition of distributional preferences, that opera football can't be a Nash equilibrium either. Again, unless both of these people are just really, really deeply hostile to themselves and their partners. Then the question is, could it nonetheless become equilibrium when we introduce issues of reciprocity? Okay. So suppose player 1 believes that player 2 will go to the opera. So player 1 believes player 2 will go to the opera, and that she believes player 2 believes player 1 will go to the football game. In other words, assume that player 1's beliefs are correct.